It's a pleasure to be here. See everybody. Patrick,
Hi, Violet. Let me
do you
let
have
me
a
go through
question?
the three questions that we ended up talking about, and then maybe you can decide which ones you want to start addressing first.
Well,
Um,
yeah. Maybe you could read one out loud so that people could hear the question.
sure, sure. The three questions we were going to focus on today a little bit is
I'm going to start with one.
okay.
Yeah,
Um, Someone had written in
one.
with some concern that what do we do with a child who has never experienced safety and they've never had any real life experience with being safe? And what we're doing is asking them to draw a safe place, but they have nothing in their real life to relate it to.
Yeah. You know, I heard the questions, but I decided not to answer them ahead of time because it's much easier for me to just go with it now. My feeling is that all children really can imagine a good place, a place where nothing bad happens. I think that it is not unusual for a child to have that kind of imagination, even if they've never experienced a good place. I actually know because I've worked with kids who have had very bad, terrible, painful, traumatic lives. At the same time, there is a little brief place where they can imagine something good happening, something different than what is. So if you wanted them to draw a place like that, you would need to say, ask them to draw a place that they uh, maybe don't know, but a place they could imagine being a good place. I think that any child would be able to do that. If not, then ask them to draw a bad place, something out of a bad place. And then at some point after hearing about it, you might say, could you draw something the opposite of that? Not like that, something that would not be, some place where there would not be bombs dropping, some place where you'd have plenty of food, and I think they could get into that. If you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's really wonderful. I especially love the part of being able to meet kids where they're at, and if their experience is only terribleness and disaster and awful
Yeah.
experiences, to meet them there and to start there, having them draw that and
Yes.
using that as a starting, well, not even just a starting point, but an acknowledgement of where they're at. And then it's beautiful how you can bring in the polarity of that or the opposite of. Um, no, that's wonderful. The other thing I want to just put out to everyone is as Violet's answering these questions, if there's even a follow-up thought or question you want to put on the chat board, I'll monitor that for Violet, and I'll be happy to circle back around that if there's time.
Okay, you want to do another question?
Sure, sure. Um, the other question that came up is one of the therapists has been working with families that are coping with the coronavirus by nonstop eating, and that both the parents can't stop eating and the children are eating all the time. And she wondered what's a good way of approaching that, where eating is the primary issue for the family. And so any thoughts you might have about that?
Well, when Patrick and I talked about this, it was interesting because, uh, anyway, about getting them to stop eating. The parents are eating, so the kids naturally go ahead and eat as well. uh, I don't know what they're eating. I had some thought that if they were eating something healthy, that would be good. They could give their kids carrots to eat. I used to give my kids carrots all the time when they wanted something to eat before dinner or before a meal because it was healthy and it kept them busy. You know, it's not that easy to eat a raw carrot. So that was one thought I had. Another thought I had was that for particularly the parents should think about what they could do instead of eating to kind of make a list of other things they could do that would be better than just eating. Like you mentioned that if you get anxious, you eat potato chips. You know, it's something healthy. Eat
My,
it.
my secret is out.
And anyway, so instead, when they get the urge to have to eat, they could have a list of things they could do instead. On the other hand, another thing they could do is to draw a picture of what that feels like. I still remember the time I was giving a workshop, and at the break, a guy came up to me and he said, "I'm so anxious about what you were talking. I am so anxious. I don't know what to do. I feel so anxious." And I happened to have in front of me on the table a tin of markers and a paper. And I said, I couldn't think of what to say to him. So I said, "Would you show me on this paper how you feel anxious? Here are these different colors of markers. Here's the paper. Just scribble something that shows me how anxious you feel." And he picked some markers and he did that. And when he was finished, he said, "Oh, thank you. I feel so much better now." Wow, that was a lesson for me that this can work, you know. So they could just get some paper and markers or crayons and just scribble what they're feeling, you know, that they need to eat to keep themselves from having to gorge on food. And maybe that would be good for the kids to do as well, especially if they see their parents doing it. So that was one suggestion I had. What about you, Pat?
Well, you know, I also really like the idea that you had of helping parents come up with ideas or helping kids come up with ideas of other soothing things. Kind of what the cognitive therapists would call substitute, like substitute behaviors, like what would make kids feel good or the adults feel good instead of eating. You know? I think that was a great, even coming up with a list or some different alternatives. You know, the other thing I was wondering is that in that same line of thought, whether either parents or kids sometimes could even interrupt their eating and before they go to the food, just be able to write down how they're feeling or just even say out loud how they're feeling. Yeah. If you maybe break apart that sequence a little bit so people can acknowledge and just say, "I'm nervous," or "I'm anxious," or "I'm feeling really upset," and then give themselves 30 seconds before they eat. Maybe the desire might lessen a little bit, just acknowledging the feeling underneath.
There was a third question. Do you have it there?
Pardon?
There is another question.
Oh, okay. The third question. I just want to acknowledge someone said that how about some other oral activities like yelling or singing?
Absolutely, that would be terrific.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, I heard a brief podcast, or not a podcast, a little educational video from that trauma specialist, Bessel van Dork, I think. And he was talking about some really interesting things about singing, that when we're in trauma or going through a lot of intense grief, that, like the Italians singing on the balcony, our ability to sing to each other is kind of a healing process. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, I think that really would be wonderful. In
Yeah.
fact, writing a song about how you feel or singing a song that expresses, oh, I'm feeling so anxious today. I want to eat, something like that.
I see cookies everywhere. Everywhere there's a cookie. It's a wonderful idea. A third question came up, which really also seems to have something to do with working with parents, or working with parents that may not be supportive or cooperative in the online therapy process. And someone had written that the parents several parents they're working with are so impacted, so having these experiences of their own with trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, maybe their own mental illness, that the parents are not really supportive of making their kids available for online sessions, that the parents' own mental health issues or their own trauma issues sort of make it so that they don't prioritize the online therapy process. But, I would imagine it's kind of similar with real life process, not just online. Maybe could you talk a little bit about parents who may be reluctant to have their kids in therapy, whether it's online or in person, because of their own problems, their own mental health problems, their trauma? If you have any thoughts about that.
That's a big one. That's a big one. Well, when you're working with parents who are somewhat resistant, a lot of parents are embarrassed. They don't want to show that they have problems, resist, for instance, bringing kids into therapy because of that. And only way I know, I've said to parents, if your kid had to go to the dentist, would you ask them if they want to go, or would you just say forget it, or if they didn't want to go? And they all said no, we'd make them go because they have to get their teeth fixed, something was wrong. And I sort of having the same idea of, you got a problem, it's got to be fixed, whether you, if you feel embarrassed because you think you're the only one, maybe reassure them that you're not the only one that feels this way. I can't think of a specific answer for this.
It's a tough one. It really is.
The what?
It is a tough one.
Yeah. And it's got to be some way of making that relationship, even if it's on the phone, to make it so that they don't feel that they're being judged, or that there's something shameful about seeking help. Even I sometimes read, and I know a lot of the parents do, Dear Abby, or whatever the name is, Dear Amy, and she often says you need to seek counseling. And sometimes I refer to that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because it makes them feel they're going with the flow rather than being, specifically whatever criticized or shameful.
Right.
That's a hard one.
Violet, I wonder if you look at it with the idea that maybe these parents are having their own difficulties and they just sort of can't help their children for one reason or another.
Sure.
Do you sometimes, like, I know you've talked a little bit in terms of regular therapy, in your office therapy, about how you work with parents. Would you have the parent maybe participate in part of the online session, or do a check-in with that parent? or maybe somehow try to address the parents' distress, or would you just stay with the child?
No, I think many parents need to be part of the session. They want to be part of the session. They want to know what you're doing with their children. Sometimes it's important at some point to see the child alone because they are individuals. So no, I would often see parents. One of the things I try to stress with parents, sometimes I'll say, to help your kid not be so anxious, if that's a problem, is to have a regular schedule, no matter what's going on. They need to know, they feel better if they know what time to eat, what time to go to bed, what time to have a play session. Specific times are very comforting for children to know. Interestingly enough, I have a cat. My cat I've had her for, she's now 18 years old, but she's still very lively. And one of the things I noticed is she follows a schedule. She knows when she's supposed to eat. She knows when she climbs into bed with me at night. She knows she doesn't do it before it's time or later. She knows exactly the time. She seems to be more relaxed because she knows what to expect. And I think that is true for children. Very, very true. And it's very hard in a situation like now with the pandemic to follow a schedule for some people, but it's really important to keep the child relaxed and feeling safe to follow the specifics. You can make exceptions, but then you say, we'll make an exception to the child. But I think that's an important issue. We had one more question that came in later, Patric. I think that
Okay.
I'm going to ask Martha to read it.
Okay. What about adolescents that need therapy, that are experiencing OCD, depression, Asperger's, and they feel comfortable at home and parents agree with them to pause therapy?
Did you get that?
I didn't understand the question. Could you repeat it briefly?
Instead of repeating, I'm just going to say what I read it. The kid is having problems, OCD, depression, and they're saying, I'm okay. And the parents are saying they're okay. How do you encourage them to continue having support or to feel okay to call back and have another session or something instead of just simply quitting?
My goodness. Yeah. Well, again, as you mentioned before, starting with them where they are, and if they're not feeling that it's giving them problems, that's where they are. They're trying to cope with their depression or their OCD as best they can. Believe me, they know they have a problem. Deep down underneath that, they know things aren't exactly right. I don't think they believe they can be, helped. They need some guidance for knowing that they need that some help can be available. I don't know whether the question wants to know what I would do to help them with these problems, because that's too big to answer right now. Yeah. How I would work with OCD.
I think the question is, if they're saying they're okay and they want to quit, what should the therapist do? Knowing that actually the child is not okay. They have these severe problems.
Well, whenever I've had a situation like that, I say to the parent, your child has done, maybe I've seen that child for a few sessions, has really done well, but there's still a lot more work to do. Maybe we need to take a break for a couple of weeks and then come back and see what's going on. I mean, you can't force the child to come. You cannot force any of it. What do you think, Patric?
You know, that's been my experience. In fact, just this week, one of the teenagers that I work with, who is on the autism spectrum, and you know, the first session we had online, he wouldn't allow me to look at him because he's really uncomfortable being seen, and his social awkwardness is really uncomfortable for him. And so he had the first session that I couldn't see him, which was really challenging for online therapy. But then last week when I met with him, I could feel like it was just very hard. I was, you know, like it felt like pulling teeth all the time to ask every question, and he was just not revealing a lot of himself. And recognizing that, you know, we've had a really good therapy relationship, you know, and maybe partly because of the autism spectrum, but also partly just his uncomfortableness with being seen in his own room. It maybe was almost too intimate. So we tried a different room, and he still, by the end of the session, he said, you know, I just don't think this is working for me very well. And we talked about that for a while, what wasn't working. And I had to acknowledge that it didn't feel really productive to me either. It wasn't as productive as in the office. And we decided we made a deal of one more session where we would talk about why it wasn't working well, or how it felt to be, you know, it felt to him, he was like, well, it feels a little bit like wasting my time. You know, and I just had to say, well, let's, you know, next week we'll figure this out, and maybe we should take a break. You know, to me, there's nothing worse than forcing someone into doing therapy work when they don't want to be there. And so I think that idea, Violet, of taking a break is really good.
Yeah. And being specific, you know, like, how about you come back in 2 weeks?
Uh-huh.
3 weeks, you know, being specific about coming back.
Right.
That's good. One of the things that I learned a lot from working with adolescents is that they know a lot more than anybody ever thinks they do. And I've had good results when I've explained how I work and what kind of why I do you know, things I do, why I might ask them to pound clay instead of, you know, talking about it, but doing it. Things like that. Why? Just explaining what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And I had a kid, for instance, it's just I didn't even explain to him, but he was 11 and he was drawing. I asked him to draw a superhero because that was what he liked a lot. And he started to draw it, and he said, I know why you're asking me to do this. And I said, oh, why? Because you want me to feel my power. That's what he said. And I I just thought that was amazing because he just went right ahead drawing it and could get into it. And he was that superhero and what he was going to do and all that. He was very cooperative. So I think that helps too, to maybe tell kids why you're doing what you're doing or what you hope will happen.
Right. You know, there have been a couple of comments in the chat section where someone has said they have a couple of teenagers who actually prefer telephone to video, to give that as an option. John Blen was mentioning that he has a teenage client who's struggling a bit with transitioning gender-wise, who's actually happier to have sessions on the telephone. So maybe, you know, that's a great idea. Instead of video, maybe just plain telephone.
Yeah. Anything else on that chat? I don't see it. So.
You know, Karen mentioned the idea of sometimes when you need to maybe do the break, or maybe not meet for a couple of weeks, or to take a bit of a break based on what the child or the teenager is saying, to phrase it in that just for now, just for now, we won't be meeting, or just for now, we'll be taking a little bit of a break. I know with the kid that I was working with, we did an agreement to, if this is still going on, meet in 3 weeks, and then maybe talk about the idea of we wouldn't meet until this was over, and we would meet again in person afterwards. Someone said maybe the client could actually write a letter and do some of the therapy work in a letter format. So there's been a lot of really good feedback in the chat here.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so if anybody has any questions, I'd be delighted to hear from you. And you can email me at violet.oaklander@gmail.com. And I can't always answer fully a question, but they're always, I love getting them. I love seeing what you're concerned about. And so, do the best I can, as I know you do, Patric.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The other idea that I had that was precipitated by a comment from the chat section was somebody, I think Liz had mentioned she has a couple of teenagers who didn't even want to try the video. And what the guardians and she agreed on was to do some just simple check-in phone calls. And I think that's a really good point, because it may be that if we're too stuck to our 1 hour sessions or 50-minute sessions online, that maybe we have to recalibrate a little bit. And maybe that teenager or child, I work with somebody who we've changed from 50 minutes to 30 minutes because he has attention deficit disorder and he just cannot stay focused and present other than running around in his room for 30 minutes. And we're both happy to change our session from an hour to 30 minutes. Yeah. But I think even for some kids, that just a simple check-in, even if it's, not a session, but a 5-minute, how are you doing? And, what's going on? And how is it to have school at home now? And not necessarily even have it kind of a therapy session, quote unquote, but just a friendly check-in helps with the relationship.
Very much, especially if you participate and yourselves.
Absolutely.
And I thought of something that I used to do. I haven't done it recently, but it was adolescents just loved it. And that was, especially now that we're using the internet so much, movies particularly. We can't go to the movies because the movies are closed. And anyway, is that we used to make a little movie with the video. We made several movies with different kids. We made several movies, and each one made their own movie. They decided what it would be like and who would play what part. And we'd just spontaneously make this movie, and then we would replay it, and watch it. And it was always absolutely wonderful.
Ah, neat.
Doing things like that could be very helpful today.
And especially if you're a technological person, which I am not as much, I'm trying to catch up, but kids use things like TikTok app to create like videos, and they can be short videos. There could be some really interesting things about that. In fact, someone here asked, how would you process a musical or a dramatic activity online? And you're already addressing that a little bit. You could maybe even do like a videotaped production.
Yeah. Have to figure out how to do it. The kids probably know how to do it themselves.
They can teach us.
Always.
The other thing somebody else commented on, and I'd like to comment on, is, or have you comment on, or maybe just acknowledge is a better way of putting it, is that one of the people had mentioned, I think it was Anne, said that having some contact online also addresses some of the kids' needs or teenagers' needs to know that we're okay. If there's no contact at all, they may be wondering how we're doing in this and whether we're healthy or we're okay, and how important it is maybe that they have this check-in, even just to see that that we're okay.
Right, that's a good point, yes.
Right. Which is a good transition point, because I know John is going to John Blen is going to facilitate our next activity. Violet, you've been great with this. Thank you. Your ideas, as usual.
I like this conversation.
It is great.
Well, why don't we have it again maybe next week? As long as you're available, we would love to have more conversations with you.
I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah, well, we aren't either, actually.
Yeah.
Yes, we're all available.